Hola, clase. Hoy vamos a aprender los verbos reflexivos. You have probably seen or heard reflexive verbs being used in Spanish, but you might not have understood what makes them different from regular verbs. So in this lesson today, we're going to learn about what reflexive verbs are and how to use them in Spanish. Now, you'll want to keep in mind that we don't use reflexive verbs in English. And so you'll see that in the examples as I go through this lesson. But just remember that these are going to kind of be a new concept. And so you really have to stay focused and really pay attention throughout the video so that you can get a good grasp on how reflexive verbs work in Spanish, since, like I said, we don't have them in English. All right, so the first question that I want to answer is, what is a reflexive verb? A reflexive verb is an action that we do to ourselves. So actions that we do to ourselves, not to other people. Let me give you some examples. On your vocabulary list for this chapter, we've got about 15 vocabulary words that are reflexive verbs. And so we'll be learning those along with this grammar lesson. Let me put a couple up here on the screen. So one reflexive verb that's on your list is acostarse. So let me put that here. Acostarse, and you can copy it down while I do this. So acostarse. Acostarse means, I'll write it small over here, the definition, to put yourself to bed. That's a big definition, right? Acostarse means to put yourself to bed. So this is an action you're doing to yourself, all right? And you'll notice that in English, we don't have just one verb that represents that whole entire phrase. In Spanish, we can just say acostarse or use this verb. We have to conjugate it and everything. But we can use this verb, acostarse, and it means that whole entire phrase, to put yourself to bed. So in English, we don't have reflexive verbs. We just have to use a phrase using the present tense or the preterite tense or whatever tense we're in, to mean what or to get across like that we're doing this action to ourselves. Another example, how about ducharse? Ducharse. And the definition of that is to give yourself a shower. All right, so again, this is an action that you do to yourself, and the reflexive verb in Spanish, ducharse, means that whole entire phrase in English, to give yourself a shower. So it's nice because in Spanish, we can just use one reflexive verb, and it explains this whole entire idea of doing this action to ourselves. So that's why it's called a reflexive verb, because the action that we're doing reflects back on ourselves. All right. There's other examples on your list. So maquillarse, to put makeup on yourself. Vestirse, to get yourself dressed. Bañarse, to give yourself a bath. And so all of these reflexive verbs are actions that you do to yourself or that someone does to themselves. I can say she gives herself a shower, or we give ourselves a shower, or they put makeup on themselves. You put makeup on yourself. And so you just conjugate the verb, of course, to match the person, but they're all actions that the person in the sentence is doing to themselves. All right, so here I want to give you an example of one of our reflexive verbs being used in a sentence. So, yo me lavo las manos. We're actually using the verb lavarse here. So I'll write that verb up here, okay? And you can see that we have taken that little bit off on the end and changed it to me, and then we've conjugated our verb lavar to lavo, so it matches our subject, which our subject is yo, I. So this means I washed my hands. Now you will notice that we did say las instead of like mis manos, my hands. And that's really important because in Spanish, we don't want it to be redundant in this case. So there's no reason to say my hands or to put mis manos, because we already know that they're my hands because we said yo in the me. And so we just put las. You just always use, whenever you're talking about body parts, you always use the article like el or la or los or las. You never use me or tu or anything like that. You never use the possessive adjectives when you're talking about those. All right. So this is an example of a reflexive verb. Okay. So me lavo, that's using the verb lavarse reflexively because you are doing this action to yourselves. But I want to show you in the next example that you can also use just the verb lavar, which means to wash, when you're doing actions to other people. Okay, so reflexive verbs, they have a reflexive version of themselves, and then they also have a regular version of themselves. All right, so let's look at this sentence. Yo lavo el carro. So this is in the present tense, and we're just conjugating the verb lavar to lavo, right? So I wash the car. But you'll see that we don't have that reflexive thing. We don't have the may in front of this verb or anything like that. And that's because we are not using lavar reflexively in this sentence. I am washing the car. I'm washing an object. I'm not washing myself. So we can just use the verb lavar when we want to talk about washing the car or washing something else. If we're washing ourselves, then that's when we need to use the reflexive verb lavarse, which means to wash oneself, and then we put that in our sentence like the example before. Here's another example of a reflexive verb being used in a sentence. So, yo me cepillo los dientes. So I brush my teeth. All right. You'll see again that we don't put we don't put mis, we put los. Of course, it gets translated to English as my, but we write los dientes for teeth, my teeth. And then you'll also see we took our verb, so cepillarse. Cepillarse is to brush oneself or to brush one's own teeth in this case. And so we conjugated that verb cepillarse in the present tense. We took the se, changed it to me so that it matches our subject yo. And then we took the AR off and added an O. So yo me cepillo los dientes, because this is an action that we're doing to ourselves. So here's an example of the verb cepillar being used in a non-reflexive way. Yo cepillo los dientes del perro. So I brush my dog's teeth or the dog's teeth. And we're just using the verb cepillar. Okay, so we're not using a reflexive verb in this case to say this sentence because this is an action that we're doing to the dog, not to ourselves. So when you read a sentence or when you're getting ready to write a sentence, you need to know whether to use the reflexive verb or to just use the verb all by itself. And you have to know that based on whether or not you're doing the action to yourself. If you're doing the action to yourself, you use the reflexive verb. If you're doing the action to something or someone else, then you're not going to use the reflexive verb. So a lot of verbs have two versions of themselves. They have the reflexive verb version of themselves with like the say on the end, and then they have the regular version of themselves with the AR, ER, or IR on the end. And you have to decide which one you're supposed to use. All right, so we've been talking about verbs and how they kind of can have two versions of themselves. And so I want to help you understand, how to tell which version you're working with. So how to identify a reflexive verb? Well, it's actually really easy because a reflexive verb will always have a reflexive pronoun like se. So lavarse, maquillarse, vestirse, ponerse, all of the words on your vocabulary list. So despertarse, ducharse, lavarse, levantarse, ponerse, quitarse, they all have se on the end. So whenever a verb has a se on the end, you know that it's a reflexive verb. If it doesn't have the se on the end, so if you just have lavar, if you just have maquillar, then you know that the verb is in its non-reflexive form. It's not being used with its like reflexive version, all right? So that's how you know if it's a reflexive verb, if it has the se on the end of it. In order to use reflexive verbs, you'll need to know how to use reflexive pronouns. So depending on who your subject is, you're actually going to pick a different pronoun. So if your subject is yo, you're going to use the reflexive pronoun may. If your subject is to, so if you're saying you are doing something to yourself, then you're going to use the reflexive pronoun te. If your subject is él, ella, or usted, so it's he or she or the formal version of you that's doing an action to themselves, then you're going to use the reflexive pronoun se. If your subject is nosotros, you'll use nos. And if your subject is ellos, ellas, ustedes, you'll use se. You will notice that the reflexive pronoun is the same for él, ella, usted, and ellos, ellas, ustedes. And you just have to know the context in order to know who your subject would be when you see these reflexive pronouns used in a sentence. So here's just some quick practice with this. I'll wait here for a second so you can do a few of these. Of course, you can pause the video and just look at these subjects and then decide based on the subject, what should your reflexive pronoun be based on what the subject is. So like that first one's done for you. If your subject is yo, then you would need to use the reflexive pronoun may. So if your subject is ella, what should your reflexive pronoun be? You said say, you would be correct. So that one should be say. The next one, if your subject is to, what should it be? Well, if you look at the chart on the previous slide, it would be de. Nosotros is nos. Emily, so this is kind of like saying ella, right? We're saying she. So she's doing something to herself. We're going to need to use the reflexive pronoun se. For usted, it's going to be se. You'll notice that you use se a lot because it takes care of a lot of your subjects. Marco y Jevin, we use se. Mi amigo y yo, so my friend and I, we're saying that we do something to ourselves. So we need to use nos. Ellas, so they, we're going to use se. Tyler, so we're saying he, she, those both use se. All right. So whenever you are using reflexive verbs, you need to make sure that you can identify who your subject is and figure out which reflexive pronoun you need to use in the sentence. So using reflexive verbs in a sentence is really easy. There's just 2 steps. All you have to do to use a reflexive verb is pick the pronoun that best matches the subject, and then conjugate the verb to match the subject as well. So I'll show you that in a couple examples here. All right, so let's do this practice together. So we've got Julio afeitarse. So Julio shaves himself. So since our subject is he, we need the reflexive pronoun se here. All right, so we've already done the first step. We've taken care of the se. Now we have the verb afeitar, and we need to conjugate that in the present tense to match Julio, which is he. So we start like this. We take off the AR and we just add an A. So Julio se afeita. Julio shaves himself. For number 2, yo lavarse. So I wash myself. The se needs to be a me so that it matches yo. And then we take the lavar, we take off the AR, and we add O, match our yo. Yo me lavo. I wash myself. Number 3, ellos ducharse. We take the se, and we actually are going to end up just using se just like it is because it's in the ellos form. Then we take the verb duchar, and we end up with duchan. Ellos se duchan. If you have forgotten your present tense endings, your regular present tense endings, then you should probably go and review those. Number 4, to maquillarse. So you put makeup on yourself. We're going to take the se. We need to match it to the to. So we're going to use our reflexive pronoun te. And then we change maquillar to maquillas. Maquillas. We got to add an AS to the end since we're in the to form. Ella dormirse. So she puts herself to sleep. Ella, we need the se for our reflexive pronoun. And then remember, dormir in the present tense is an O to UE stem changer. So we need to change that O to a UE, duer, and then we just add our regular ending. So duerme. Ella se duerme. She puts herself to sleep, or she's herself is sleeping. Number 6, yo vestirse. Now, this is important. Keep in mind that vestirse is an E to I stem changer, so we don't want to forget that. But let's start with the end. Take off the se and put the me. So yo me. We'll do our stem change, and then we add our O on the end. So yo me visto. And then the last one, nosotros secarse. So we take our se and change that to nos. Nosotros nos. Take off the AR and add amos. So nosotros nos secamos, all right? So this is how you actually go about conjugating your verb in the present tense with reflexive verbs, all right? So it's really not that easy, or it's really not that hard. You just take off your reflexive pronoun on the end, match it to the person that's the subject of the sentence, and then conjugate your verb like normal, and you're done. Just keep in mind that there'll always be 2 blanks, and you need to fill the first blank with the reflexive pronoun, and then you need to fill the second blank with the verb conjugated to match your subject.